The morning the solicitor arrived with the deed, Constance Ellery was counting the silver, not tallying it for any pleasure of ownership. The silver had not belonged to the Ellery household for 3 years. She counted it because someone had to, because the inventory must be correct before the new master's men collected it, and because counting was a thing her hands knew how to do when the rest of her had gone quietly numb. 43 pieces. A soup tureen gone tarnished at the lip. The fish knives her mother had carried from her own mother's house, their handles worn smooth where a thumb rested. Constance counted them twice, wrote the number in the ledger, and did not allow herself to feel anything particular about either the fish knives or the ledger. It was the first week of December, 1812, and Hartwell Park was being sold. She had understood this was coming. The entail had never favored her. Her father had died without a male heir, and the estate had passed first to a distant cousin who spent 2 seasons losing what remained of it at cards, then to a creditor whose name she had not known until the solicitor Mr. Crane had appeared at the door in September with papers she could not dispute and a manner she could not fault, because he had been perfectly courteous about the whole business of taking everything she had ever called home. The auction of the principal contents had been set for the 3rd week of December. The deed for the land and the house itself was being signed today. She had been told she might remain through Christmas as a courtesy of the new owner, and she had thanked the solicitor for relaying that information and had gone back to counting silver. The Ellery family had held Hartwell for 140 years. Constance was 23 years old, and she had learned in the past 18 months that 140 years could be reduced to a ledger entry with very little ceremony. She had learned other things also. She had learned that grief, given enough practical tasks, could be made to wait. She had learned that a household of 4 people, properly managed, could maintain the appearance of a household of 12 if the 4 people were the right 4 people. She had learned that she was one of the right people, which had not been the kind of discovery that produced any particular satisfaction, but had proved nonetheless useful. She heard the second carriage before she saw it. The first had brought the solicitor. The second arrived perhaps 20 minutes later, traveling at a pace that suggested neither leisure nor urgency, but a kind of settled intention. And when she heard it stop at the front, she assumed it contained the new owner's agent, or perhaps a surveyor. She did not look up from the silver. She had one arrangement left to complete before the inventory was done, and she intended to complete it. She was still at the dining table when Hartwell's old housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, appeared at the doorway with an expression Constance had not seen on the woman's face in several years. Not distress. Something stranger than distress. Something closer to the look a person wears when they have held a belief so long that its reversal requires a moment of stillness before the body understands it. "Miss Ellery?" she said, and then stopped. Constance set down the pen. The man who stepped into the dining room behind the housekeeper was not a solicitor's agent. She understood this within the first 2 seconds, though she could not have said precisely why. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a few years older, with the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have learned to carry something heavy for a long time without showing it. Dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed for travel in a coat that had once been fine and had since been subjected to conditions that had nothing to do with English drawing rooms. There was a scar at the line of his jaw, pale and old. His eyes, when they found her across the length of the dining table, were the gray of the December sky through the window behind her, and they did not look at the silver, at the ledger, or at the fish knives. They looked only at her. "Miss Ellery," he said. His voice was low and very level, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking into wind. "I am told the deed is being signed today." "It is," she said. Her own voice held, which she considered a minor accomplishment. "Then I should like to speak with the solicitor before it is." She did not know him. She was nearly certain she had never seen him in her life, and yet something about the way he stood in the doorway of the dining room of Hartwell Park, the way his eyes moved across the plasterwork ceiling, and then returned to her, made the fine hairs at the back of her neck stand still. He looked at the room the way a person looks at something they have carried in memory for a very long time and are now comparing to the original. She said, "May I ask your name?" A pause. Not a long one. Only the kind that means the answer is not simple. "Aldous Vane," he said. The name meant nothing to her. And then it did. The name arrived in her memory not as a fact she had been told recently, but as something older, something her father had mentioned once or twice, in a manner that closed the subject as soon as it opened it. Vane. A family name connected to Hartwell in some fashion she had never fully understood. A line that had died out, or so she had believed, or had been made to believe. If there was a soft invitation in the gray December air to keep watching, she could only obey it. Something had arrived at Hartwell that the inventory had not accounted for. She set down her pen and rose from the table and said, "I will take you to him." The short walk from the dining room to the library, where the solicitor had established himself with his papers, took perhaps 45 seconds. Constance had made that walk thousands of times in 23 years and had never been aware of it as a walk. She was aware of it now. She was aware of it because he walked beside her not quite at the distance that propriety prescribed, not quite close enough to violate it, but at some intermediate distance that seemed to have been arrived at without calculation, the way a person stands close to a fire, not because they are cold, but because warmth is simply the nature of the thing, and one does not trouble to justify it. She was aware of the cold air from the hall windows. She was aware of the worn runner beneath their feet. Its pattern faded to something that suggested flowers without quite achieving them. She was aware that her hands were still ink-marked from the ledger, and that there was nothing she could do about that now. She was not aware of being particularly pretty. She had been told once that she was handsome in good light, by a cousin who had meant it as a compliment and had delivered it clumsily, and she had filed the information in the category of things that were interesting, but not useful. She had spent 18 months learning which categories things belonged to. Useful things kept the household solvent. Interesting things were a luxury she had not had much occasion for lately. She opened the library door and stood aside. He looked up from his papers. Something in his expression shifted, rearranged itself. "Mr. Vane," he said. And then he said nothing else for a moment, which was unlike him. She left them to it. She returned to the dining room and the silver and the ledger, and she sat with her hands flat on the table, and she did not count anything for several minutes. She had had the sensation, in those 45 seconds of corridor, of being seen. Not remarked on, not assessed. Seen the way a landscape is seen when someone stops walking and simply looks at it, taking in the whole of it rather than cataloging its useful features. It was a sensation she could not afford to do anything with. And she was a practical woman. And so she did not. She picked up the pen. She returned to the silver. The voices from the library were not audible from the dining room. She could not hear what was said. She heard once a raised voice that was not his and not the solicitor's, but belonged instead to Mr. Ferris, the agent of the company that held the debt, who had arrived with the solicitor and had been seated in the library since before Constance had come downstairs that morning. She heard the raised voice, and then silence, and then Crane's measured, careful tones, and then silence again. If you have ever watched a thing you believed was settled begin to shift at its foundations, you know the quality of that silence. Constance sat with her pen in her hand and did not move. She had been waiting for something she could not have named for 18 months. Not rescue. She had understood early that rescue was not a category available to her. She had been waiting for resolution, which was a different thing. The particular finality of a chapter closed, rather than merely interrupted. What she had arranged for herself in the absence of resolution was endurance, which had its own dignity, and she had found, to her surprise, that she was quite good at it. She had maintained the household accounts in a state of perfect clarity. She had kept the staff. She had managed the correspondence with the firm with a precision she suspected had surprised them, because they had expected a young woman in distressed circumstances to be imprecise, and she was not. She had laid every fire herself when the junior housemaid was unwell. She had replanted the kitchen garden in the spring, because the kitchen garden produced food. And food was a practical matter. And she did not allow herself to think about the fact that she had dug it with her own hands in a garden that would belong to someone else by summer. She had done these things, and she had been adequate to all of them, and she had not wept in front of anyone since her father's funeral. And she considered this a reasonable record under the circumstances. She was still thinking about endurance and its uses when the solicitor came to the dining room at 11:30. He said, "Miss Ellery, I find that matters are somewhat more complicated than I had been led to believe." She had been waiting for this without knowing she was waiting for it. She set the pen down very precisely. "How so?" "Mr. Vane," said Mr. Crane, with the careful manner of a man who is accustomed to delivering news that lands badly and is attempting for once to deliver something that lands differently, has presented documentation that predates the transfer of Hartwell to your late cousin Mr. Ellery by some 16 years, specifically a deed of entail in remainder to the male line of the Vane family, which is the family from which the Ellery family obtained Hartwell in the year 1772, and which entail was, it appears, improperly discharged at that time. He has additionally presented documentation attesting to his identity as the legitimate surviving heir of that line, evidence which has been witnessed and sealed by 2 members of the judiciary in London. Constance said, "The estate was not sold to its new owner." "The deed was not signed," he said, with something in his voice that might have been relief. "Mr. Vane arrived in time." She processed this, the fish knives, the soup tureen, the 43 pieces of silver she had counted twice that morning, which had been her family's and then the creditor's, and were now, it appeared, part of a question more complicated than either. "What does this mean?" she said. "For the household." "That," he said, "is a matter Mr. Vane has asked me to convey that he would prefer to discuss with you directly, if you are willing." She looked at the ink on her hands. She looked at the ledger with its columns of careful numbers. "Send him in," she said. What she had not expected, when he entered the dining room the second time, was that he would remain standing near the door. He was a man who occupied space without announcing it, who could stand very still and fill a room with the quality of his attention without appearing to try. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the silver laid out in its rows. And then he looked at her with that same gray steadiness he had brought through the front door, and something in it was no longer withheld. "You have been maintaining this house," he said. Not a question. "Someone had to," she said. "For how long?" "Since my father died. 18 months. A pause. She had learned that pauses were sometimes the most honest thing available. "The household has been reduced to myself and the housekeeper and 2 of the original staff. We were told the contents would be collected after Christmas." He looked at the fish knives. She saw him look at them, and she saw something in the line of his jaw that was not pity, which she would not have tolerated. but was something more careful than pity. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of a man who understood what it cost to hold something together when the machinery of the world said it ought to fall. "My father purchased Hartwell's debt from the original holder in 1809, he said. He did not live to act on the entail claim. I was abroad when he died. I did not receive the document for another year, and it took 2 years further to establish the evidence to the court's satisfaction." He stopped. He was looking not at the silver now, but at some fixed point past her shoulder, and the scar at his jaw had gone white the way scars do when the face beneath them holds something it does not permit to show. "I had believed myself too late," she said quietly. "You were not too late." He looked back at her. In the silence that followed, Constance was aware of the fire in the dining room grate, which she had laid herself that morning because the junior housemaid was unwell, and because cold was a problem she could solve. She was aware of the snow beginning at the windows, the 1st of December, arriving unhurried and without drama the way important things sometimes do. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a manner she did not usually permit herself to notice. He said, "I will need someone who knows the state of the house, the accounts, the staff." He said it with his eyes on the middle distance and his voice very level, and it was exactly the kind of thing a practical man says when he is saying something else underneath it, and she was a practical woman, and she heard both things. She said, "I can show you the accounts." It was an invitation, and they both understood it as such. He came to the table, and she opened the ledger, and they sat across the corner of it together in the December light. And she showed him what she had spent a year and a half building out of diminishing resources, the economies, the careful calculations, the list of which staff had stayed without full wages because they had nowhere else to go, and because Constance had promised them she would not forget. He was quiet while she explained it. He asked questions that were precise and showed he had understood her. Once, when she reached across the ledger to indicate a column of figures, her wrist came within a few inches of his hand on the table, and neither of them moved away, and after a moment she continued pointing to the column. If she was aware of that moment more than its practical content warranted, she did not say so. She was a practical woman. She moved on. He stayed for dinner. This was not planned, precisely. But there was an ease to the way it happened, the way the housekeeper appeared at the library door at 3:30 and said that there was food enough if Mr. Vane cared to stay, and the way he said he cared to, without ceremony or excess. Constance ate at the same table she had eaten at for 23 years, and found it different for his presence. Not intrusively so, but genuinely. The way a room is different when it has been properly occupied after standing empty. He had been in Portugal. He told her this over the fish course, the fish knives moving between them without comment from either. He had been there when his father died, and the letter had taken 3 months to find him, and by then the estate matters were already in progress. He had a way of describing difficult events as facts rather than grievances, which she recognized as a discipline she had also cultivated and understood the cost of. When she said something wry about the solicitors, which she had not intended to say, and which she regretted the moment it was out of her mouth, the corner of his lips moved in a way that was almost, but not quite a smile. And it was, she thought, the most genuinely beautiful thing she had seen in quite some time. She looked at her plate. He asked, over the second remove, about the kitchen garden. She had not mentioned the kitchen garden. He had apparently noticed it in passing when he arrived. He asked what she had planted in the spring, and she told him. And he listened in the way that men rarely listened, with his attention fully present, rather than held in reserve for the moment his own contribution would arrive. She found she had rather more to say about the kitchen garden than she had anticipated. He found, it appeared, rather more interest in her answer than she had expected. By the end of the dinner, she had told him about the lavender border her mother had planted 20 years ago and the way it came back reliably each June, regardless of what the winter had done, and she was not entirely certain how she had arrived at the subject of her mother's lavender, only that it had seemed a natural destination, and that he had looked at her throughout the telling with those gray-green eyes, and a steadiness she was beginning to understand was not mere politeness. After dinner, she meant to excuse herself. She said something to this effect. He said, without quite looking at her, that there was a question about the East Wing inventory that he had been unable to resolve from the documents, and that he thought she might be able to clarify it. She said she could try. They went to the East Wing. The East Wing was cold, the fires there having been banked for weeks to conserve fuel, and she had not thought to bring her shawl, and he did not comment on this directly. But by the time they had been walking for 5 minutes, he was carrying the discussion to the side of the corridor nearest the single remaining sconce, and positioning himself, she noticed, between her and the drafts from the east-facing windows. She noticed and did not mention it, and moved through the rooms answering his questions about the inventory, and was aware, at every moment, of exactly where he was in relation to where she was. The East Wing had not been used since her father's illness. There was a pianoforte there, in the small drawing room at the end of the corridor, that had been her mother's. Someone had left a piece of music open on it years ago, and the music had never been moved. And the sight of it had become so ordinary to Constance that she had stopped seeing it. She saw it now. He stopped beside her in the doorway and looked at the piano, and then at her. And she said very simply, "My mother's." And he said nothing at all, which was the correct response. She had learned to be cautious of men who filled silences with comfort they had not earned. He was not that kind of man. He stood beside her in the cold drawing-room doorway and let the silence be the size it needed to be. And she was grateful for it in the particular way she was grateful for things she had not known she needed until they arrived. They stood there for what was probably half a minute, though it did not feel like half a minute. And then she turned and led him back down the corridor and answered his remaining inventory questions with great attention, and if her voice was not quite its ordinary, steady self, she did not think he noticed. Or perhaps he noticed and was kind enough not to remark on it, which was the same thing, practically speaking, and perhaps better. The accounts placed the household in a position that was, as she told him the following morning, not unworkable. The staff wages that had been deferred could be met if the December rents came in correctly. The East Wing repairs could be phased across 2 years if the budget were carefully managed. The silver was intact, and the contents that remained were in good condition, having been properly maintained by a household that had refused to treat neglect as inevitable, simply because ownership was uncertain. She had not, she told him, permitted neglect. It seemed important to be precise about this. He was precise about things himself. He brought her a list of questions each morning that suggested he had been thinking about the accounts in the evening, and she answered them and occasionally corrected his assumptions, and he received the corrections without defensiveness, which she found striking. Men of his station were not always capable of that. He was capable of it in a way that seemed habitual, as though having his assumptions corrected by someone who knew more than he did on a specific subject was simply an accurate description of the situation and not a blow to be absorbed. On the second day, reviewing the rent roll, he asked for her opinion on a specific tenant's arrears, and she gave it, and he looked at her for a moment as though she had said something that surprised him, though she had only said what seemed to her accurate and obvious, and then he wrote it down in his own hand, in the margin of the ledger, and went on to the next entry. She did not know, precisely, when she had begun to feel the pull of him as something other than circumstance. She suspected it had been in the corridor on the first day, the 45 seconds she still found herself thinking about in odd moments. She did not examine this at length. She was a practical woman, and she had learned that examining things at length produced no more clarity than observing them carefully from a short distance, and also prevented the observing. On the third day, in the library, the housekeeper announced that Lady Hartington had called. Constance knew Lady Hartington. She was the wife of Sir Edmund Hartington, whose estate bordered Hartwell to the north, and she was a woman whose social authority operated on the principle that anything she had not explicitly approved was implicitly disapproved of. She had managed, in the years since Constance's father died, to refer to Constance in any company she found convenient as poor Miss Ellery, in a tone that made the poor do a great deal of work. When Hartwell's troubles became known, the woman had called twice, ostensibly in sympathy, and had spent both calls examining the state of the furnishings with the focused attention of a woman cataloging what might come up at auction. She entered the library now and surveyed the scene of him at the desk, and Constance standing at the shelves with a book of property records, and made an assessment, audible in the quality of her inhale, that something here required management. "My dear Miss Ellery," she said, "I had heard that a Mr. Vane had arrived, but I had not understood the circumstances were quite so irregular." "The circumstances are quite regular," Constance said, with her voice perfectly even. "Mr. Vane is Hartwell's heir. He is reviewing the estate accounts. With you, however, quite unchaperoned, and you so recently in rather reduced circumstances, and your position at Hartwell so very uncertain, I must say I had hoped someone would have made proper arrangements." Her eyes moved between them with the professional speed of a woman who has trained her gaze to carry information efficiently. One would not wish for any misunderstanding about the nature of Miss Ellery's presence here, given the irregularity of the household's recent history. "Poor Miss Ellery," Constance said, not to the woman standing before her, but to the book of property records, which she closed. The words came out very quietly and very precisely. "You have called me that in 3 counties for 18 months. The lady blinked. "I have managed this household," Constance continued, still with her voice at its ordinary pitch, "through a period of considerable difficulty, without assistance from anyone who now finds the irregularity of the arrangement worth remarking on. I am not poor Miss Ellery. I am Miss Constance Ellery of Hartwell, and I am reviewing the estate accounts because I know them better than anyone alive, and that knowledge is useful to the owner of this estate, and I see no irregularity in usefulness." The silence that followed was of the variety produced when a room has not expected a quiet woman to say a quiet thing, and has been slightly disarranged by the experience. Aldous Vane, at the desk, had gone very still. "She said, with a readjustment of her manner that she covered as best she could. "Of course, my dear. I did not intend any slur on your character. I only thought, for your own sake, that someone ought to say something." "Someone has," Constance said. After she had departed, there was a long quiet in the library. Constance returned the book of property records to its shelf, and felt her hands were not entirely steady, which she considered she was entitled to under the circumstances. She heard him cross the room. He stopped beside the shelves, not behind her, at a proper distance, close enough that she was aware of the steadiness of him. "Miss Ellery," he said. "I apologize," she said, before he could say anything further. "That was perhaps not the most strategic way to handle it." "No," he said. There was something in the one syllable that made her turn and look at him. "It was the only way to handle it." His eyes, close, were not gray after all. They were gray-green, the color of the parkland in the rain, and they held something that had not been there before. Or had been there before, but not for her to see. Not in this clear a light. She was near enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of them that belonged to men who have spent time squinting into distance, into sun, into horizons that required sustained attention. She said carefully, "I am not sure what my position at Hartwell is now." It was an honest thing to say. She was not a woman who knew how to say dishonest things with any efficiency. "I know what your position at Hartwell is," he said. "I have known since the second morning." The logs in the library grate shifted. Outside, the snow had continued without ceasing, and the park lay under a white quiet that made the house feel very contained, very specific, very exactly where it was. He said, "I would ask you to hear me, and then to say whatever you think is honest, because I have found you to be a very honest woman, and I would not want a different kind of answer from you." She looked at him. She said, "Go on." "I have managed to recover this estate," he said, "through 6 years of effort that included a good deal of time abroad, and some years of difficulty I will not detail now, though I will, if you want to know them, at another time. What I have not managed to recover, in 6 years of effort, is any occasion to be in the same room as a person I genuinely wanted to be in the same room as." He paused. The scar at his jaw was white again. "I want to be in the same room as you. I want to be in this room and every room in this house. I would like, with your consent, to arrange for that to be possible on a permanent basis." She was a practical woman. She said, "You are proposing marriage." "I am," he said, "if you will have me. I understand if the circumstances make the question feel like a transaction, and I want you to know that I do not experience it as one. I experience it as the first thing since I came through the front door that has felt like something worth having arrived at." She thought about the fish knives. She thought about 18 months of ledgers and cold east wings, and the woman who had called her poor in 3 counties, and the housekeeper's face at the doorway, and the way he had let the silence be the right size in the drawing room with her mother's piano. She thought about his hands on the desk, which were the hands of a man who had worked, who had made things right through effort, rather than through the luck of being in the right room at the right time, which was something she understood about herself as well. She thought about the kitchen garden and the lavender border, and the way he had listened across the dinner table with the whole of his attention. She thought about the 45 seconds of corridor that she was still, she admitted to herself now, thinking about. She thought about that moment when her wrist had been within a few inches of his hand, and neither of them had moved away. She said, "Yes." He did not say anything immediately. She was glad of this. She thought a man who filled that particular silence immediately would have been demonstrating that he had not understood the weight of the answer, and this man understood the weight of most things. Then he said, very quietly, "Constance." It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it the way one hears a thing that has been coming for some time, arriving at last, the particular quality of a sound that was always going to be said and has only been waiting for the right moment. Her breath was not entirely even. She did not mind. She had decided somewhere in the preceding days that minding about such things in his presence was more effort than it was worth. He reached out and took her hand, carefully, the way a person handles something they intend to keep. She felt the warmth of it through her fingers, and did not look away. The next day brought the solicitor back to Hartwell with the revised papers. He arrived to find Constance at the desk in the library, and Aldous at the window with a cup of coffee, and the quality of the room was sufficiently altered from 2 days prior that Crane went very still in the doorway for a moment before proceeding. Constance said, "There will be an additional matter to put in order before you leave. Mr. Vane and I have come to an understanding." He looked between them once, with the expression of a man in whom many things are being rapidly recalculated. And then he said, "Yes, Miss Ellery," and sat down. There were papers that required witnessing. There was the question of settlements, which Aldous handled with a straightforwardness that acknowledged Constance's situation without requiring it to be the central subject of every sentence, which she appreciated. There was a conversation with Mrs. Poole that afternoon, during which the housekeeper said very little and had the expression she had worn at the dining-room door on the first morning, the expression of a person whose held belief has been confirmed after a long time of being uncertain whether to hold it. She had been in service at Hartwell for 31 years. She had attended Constance's mother's confinement and laid out Constance's father's body and held the household together alongside Constance through the 18 months between, refusing wages twice when the accounts ran thin, and saying only that she had nowhere better to be, and that she would thank Miss Ellery not to insult her by suggesting otherwise. When Constance told her that evening that the papers were in order, and that she was to be married to the new master, Poole stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded and her expression that of a woman who has been proved correct in a thing she had believed without anyone else's permission for a great while. And then she said, "Very good, Miss Ellery," and went back to the stove. And Constance thought she heard something that might have been a sound of satisfaction from the direction of the kitchen, though she could not be certain, and did not inquire. The same caller arrived again 4 days before Christmas, and found Constance in the east wing, overseeing the rehanging of the curtains she had spent 2 years keeping in storage against the possibility that they would be needed. She arrived in the east wing doorway and observed the curtains, and Constance directing the hanging of them, and said, with a careful adjustment of her manner, "My dear Miss Ellery, I hear that congratulations are in order." "They are," Constance said, "and Mr. Vane is quite the unexpected arrival," she said. She had the expression of a woman who is revising a great many prior assessments and would prefer not to discuss the earlier versions of them. "He is," Constance said. She looked at the curtains, which were good deep green wool, and looked very well in the east wing light, and she allowed herself a small private satisfaction in them, which was something she had not allowed herself in quite some time. "He tends to arrive when he is most needed." She did not say anything further. She said she was delighted for them both, and departed, and Constance directed the rest of the curtain hanging without interruption. On Christmas Eve, with the house dressed as much as a house with limited staff and newly restored spirits could manage, which was rather more than she had expected given that Aldous had proven himself unexpectedly capable with a length of greenery and a ladder, they stood together in the entry hall, and she showed him the miniature she had been carrying in her jacket pocket for 18 months. It was her father's portrait, small enough to sit in a palm, painted when he was young, and still optimistic about entails. He was laughing in the portrait, which was not the face she most associated with him, but was the face she kept, because it was the one she most wanted to remember. She had carried it through the whole of the difficult year and a half without showing it to anyone, not even the housekeeper. She showed it to Aldous now. "I kept it with me," she said, "because I thought if I put it away, I might stop being able to remember clearly what he looked like." She looked at the miniature. "I thought about putting it away many times. But you did not," he said. "No," she said. He looked at the miniature for a moment, and then at her, with that gray-green steadiness that she had decided she would spend a good while longer getting used to. He said, "He would have known, I think, what kind of daughter he had raised." She closed her hand around the miniature. She did not speak for a moment. Outside, the snow fell on the park, and on the long drive where his carriage had come in, and on the stone facade of Hartwell, which had stood for 140 years, and was, it appeared, not finished standing. She said, "Let us go inside. The fire will be lit." They went in together. The fire was lit. The east wing curtains were hung, the green wool catching the candlelight in a way that made the rooms look inhabited again. Which they were. The miniature went to the mantelpiece in the small drawing room at the end of the corridor, beside the open sheet of music on her mother's piano, and it stayed there. If you have stayed long enough to watch a house come back to itself, you know what that stillness feels like. Not the stillness of something ended, but the stillness of something arrived. Hartwell was quiet that Christmas Eve in the particular way of a place that has been held together with care through the worst of it, and has now, at last, been given something to hold. If her story found a place in you, leave a word below when you are ready, and come back when you need another one. She sat that evening beside him in the library, the snow outside and the fire inside, and the accounts closed in the desk drawer for the first time in a year and a half, and when he reached over and covered her hand with his without a word of explanation, she turned her hand under his and held on, and the house around them was still.